Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Spelman Evans Downer's public sabbatical presentation. I'm part terrified and part excited to actually be with you all and share the work I've done for a 2-semester sabbatical that I was awarded in the years 2014 and 2015. We're going to look at the project that was entitled A History of Southern California Landscape. In my sabbatical, I did a lot of research into the very special history of Southern California as distinct from Northern California. Now, full disclosure, I spent many years in Northern California. I'm a Stanford graduate. I went to San Francisco State University. I spent 10 years in the Bay Area. And I was always puzzled by that rivalry that existed between Northern and Southern California. This is a painting that I did based on the ranchos of Southern California. Going back to Spanish times, the Spanish had control of California from 1769 all the way to 1821. They had 2 missions in Southern California. One was the San Gabriel Archangel Mission in the San Gabriel Valley. The other one was in San Fernando Valley. I grew up in Pasadena. I was born there in 1954. And I lived on San Pasqual Street. I actually did not know that my entire neighborhood was the San Pasqual Rancho. And it was fascinating to see that. Of course, a lot of the others, Santa Anita, they're the place names of Southern California. If you want to go to the horse races, go to Santa Anita. My research is to go out and get historic maps, then interpret them into fine art paintings. This is the one that I found to be the most useful, showing the various pueblos and giving me an orientation to the 2 missions. There's the San Gabriel one. The San Fernando one is off frame. Here, I actually have a pointer here as well. Just up here in what we call the valley. Of course, at that point, the only settlement of any significance was El Pueblo de Los Angeles, which is the kernel of what will become Los Angeles. And you can see the reason why the Spaniards built it here. It's on the place where the major water comes out of the mountains. It's the most likely place to find water year-round in Southern California. In my research, I found out that the river, for many decades and millennium, it never even reached the ocean. It actually came down, and there were bogs and estuaries, and all the water sank into the ground table. Later, it was expanded to create a waterway and come down to the coast. Southern California became a metropolitan area, and one of its shortcomings was there was no natural harbor that had to be created. The Spaniards had it till 1821, at which point there was a revolution in Mexico, and in 1821, the Mexicans had control of this part of California. They called it Alta California. From 1821. Now, they didn't have it very long. By 1848, it was already in the Mexican-American War, became part of the United States of America. It was a territory initially. And in 1850, a year after the gold rush, it became the 31st state in the United States of America. This painting is called Southern California in Spanish Times. It's a play on the colors of the Spanish flag, again, showing the geography and the rivers and not much development to speak of. El Camino Real, okay? The King's Road that connects the various missions up and down the coast. This is the Inland Empire at that time. We have the Santa Ana River. Had a lot of fun with this. The shape, if you're noticing my shapes, I love to do shapes. I love geometry of places. That's one of the subjects that I'm always investigating. This had a empire-esque shape. You're going to hear a lot about the San Gabriel River. I love rivers. This is a boondoggle development called Chicago Park. It went through many land speculative booms and busts. This is probably about the 1880s when things are just starting to heat up. Developers decided they could sell lots, often to people in the East Coast, sort of like the Arizona land scandals you hear about, bought sight unseen. Come to find out, it's on the floodplain of the river. In fact, all of these lots were unbuildable. They were very effective with their advertising campaign. They had a steamship sailing up to the new home sites of Chicago Park. Now, the chances of a steamship or a paddle wheeler making it up the San Gabriel River are absolutely nil. I think this is a close-up of the Chicago Park town site. This is the view of the San Gabriel River in Spanish-Mexican times. So there's the El Camino Real. It's going up towards the mission. There's some fields up here. They put the mission back from the river because that's where the Indians were living anyway. The Indians said, don't build on the river. Just be back a little bit and go down there when you need water. I'm working on a 1-hour documentary, and part of what I did throughout the sabbatical was I taped myself and my process. Here we are. We're going to do the close-up interpretation of the Great Flood of 1867 on the San Gabriel River. As I mentioned in the previous clip, I just did a field trip. I always like to go to places so I have a sense of what they're actually about from a real investigation on the ground, so to speak. In the meantime, I've been studying a lot of maps and looking at a lot of different diagrams, reading some history. I want to show something that, at best, we have written verbal descriptions. Nobody mapped the flood from 1867. We do have some verbal descriptions. The guy living downstream who says, what's going on? There's no water coming down the river. And it's rainy season. It's been raining. You get, 3 times the average rainfall up on top of the San Gabriels? It's almost 40 inches. So when 40 inches of rain hit the top of the mountains and it all funnels down into the Whittier Narrows, the guy who's living downstream goes, wow, the river's not flooding right now. I wonder what's happening. He goes upstream to see this giant log jam has formed, and it's pushing the river back. I've seen this in Alaska, having been in wild rivers. And it's going to create this giant dam, artificial log jam that when it busts free is going to be the Great Flood of 1867. So when this thing happens, it's so close to this other channel, which I'll be going over here, that it just blows out in that direction. And now I'm just going to go left and right until I get an asymmetrical balance. At this point, I'll go ahead and draw it out. So we're back. We've laid out a grid on the map. I use my little frame compositional device. I just set a simple grid, and now I'm scaling it up. Of course, this is 2 by 3. At this point, I'm going to take this scenario. Now, what I have to do is translate this flood that I've gone back and recreated in my own mind onto a static painting. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, but you'll see. Great Flood of 87 shall be recreated with a scuzzy cone like this. That's the way we do it. Pulled out just before we got the big slug of paint. Oh yeah. That's a flood zone. I shouldn't be giving away all my tricks. And if you haven't seen any of the real paintings, I also brought it in person. And I wanted to read the title on this one. During the historic San Gabriel River flood of 1862, a giant logjam formed in the Whittier Narrows, creating a temporary impoundment that broke loose and caused the river to change course directly south to the Pacific instead of flowing as a tributary into the Los Angeles River. Just very quickly, a log jam formed and created a dam, and it got so big that when it blew out, it went down this way instead of going further west, and literally changed the course. Along the way, I'm going to show you some of the maps that I used. This is a Pacific Electric Railway map, and I believe this says it's the largest electric rail system in the world in 1920. Basically, all the way from San Bernardino, which now is well established, and Riverside, across what will become the Foothill Freeway on the Interstate 10 corridor into Los Angeles, down to Venice. You can see Venice Boulevard, you can see Washington Boulevard. If you know Los Angeles, you can basically see the armature that became the roads that we know. Again, can't do the whole story, but fascinating to think that all of Southern California was on a very efficient electric rail system, and it was all torn up on purpose and converted to the automobile. This is my depiction of that map, showing the basic lines of the railroad. And again, if you're following the river is being adjusted. Still don't have the big harbor yet in 1920. That's coming. I use a lot of drawing tools. I was in the trades for years, so I use straight edges, I use drywall blades, I use combs, I use mastic trowels to create textures that look like urban streets. These are some of the other works I did based on Southern California now. This is not historic. This is the Santa Monica Mountains, Cahuenga Pass. Basically, this is the Hollywood part of Los Angeles, the 405, Universal Studios. I try and put everything that I know about a location into the painting. These are relatively accurate. The streets are relatively, you can see Sunset Boulevard and the way it comes down through here. This is another version of the 1920s on a circle. This is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the harbor. I read 3 books. One was by Kevin Starr. He was actually a newspaper reporter from the 20s through the 50s and lived a lot of the stories. And the boosterism and club of good old boys that got together to build Los Angeles the way we know it is just an unbelievable story. The fathers that decided to have a really great city, you need a harbor. That means you need a bunch of D9 cats. You need to get out there and start moving some sand and gravel. A city as large as Los Angeles could be built in a location without a harbor. That was literally created afterwards. Megan, you've been living down in Long Beach. You know, Long Beach itself, it was part of that whole thing to create a harbor and make Southern California into the major port city it is today. We rival San Francisco completely at this point. We have the biggest container port in the West Coast that comes in and trucks across the entire continent from this location, which is basically a swampland in 1920. Every time I go somewhere, a lot of this work, I did field trips. So if I was going to West LA or wherever it was, that's what I painted when I got home. Here's another one. This one's called West Hollywood. Next slide. Griffith Park, very, very abstract. And in fact, the title of this is Virgin Griffith Park. I painted our location as well. This is Joshua Tree National Park. At first I was going to look at a 100-year investigation of how much had Southern California changed in 100 years. The reason was I had done a show like that in New York City, and it was well received, and I was able to have a museum show. But as I worked, I quickly found out I wanted to go back further than 100 years. My natural predilection is to look at ancient time and look at geology. I did a lot of geologic studies, painting of the Santa Monicas using that map. You know, these are the major rock types and the geology of this part of the state. Quite a bit of volcanic rock in the Santa Monicas. It's quite unusual. You don't see it in the other transverse ranges in Southern California. Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, Verdugo Mountains, Pasadena. My painting style is an unusual combination of photorealism, because I actually project maps for a basic composition and a realistic depiction of place, with abstract expressionism. Those are almost diametrically opposed impulses in art. Once I have a projection, then I paint it very expressionistically. You should be able to see that in this, the very painterly, rapid, evocative of motion and activity and change. These 3, you can tell they're all done right next to each other in the same time period. Again, concentrating on that area. This one's called Santa Susana Thrust. I love these geologic terms. I actually want to pass this around. This is a small one, so it's easy to pass around. And you can kind of see the texture. Feel free to touch it and rub it. I like rubbing my paintings. One of the other things I do is I patinate the paintings. One reason I've been very glad I've had this amount of time is I let the paintings dry for about a year. I sand them and I rub them so that they get dirty and I get the color and texture that I want. When they're just pure white, they're too clean. One of my famous comments when I lived in the New York area was, well, your paintings are great of New York, but they're too clean. And I go, you're right, let's dirty them up a little bit. So ever since New York, I've been dirtying up my paintings. Can I just read this out before you look at it, Steve? It's, again, some of the titles. This is called Mulholland's Demise. The St. Francis Dam disaster floods the Ventura River, killing 600 people on March 12th, 1928. If you've been around Southern California at all, you've heard Mulholland as the great hero who brought water to the city of Los Angeles from the Owens River. Near the end of his career, the aqueduct that came from the Owens River, it never had a local storage. It basically rolled right into the San Fernando Valley. And as a water engineer, he said, we need some kind of reservoir to give us a little bit of leeway. And if you go up in the San Gabriels, in the St. Francis drainage, he decided there was a perfect place to build a dam. Other engineers looked at it and said, no, it's not a perfect place. The topography and the lithography of the rock strata are inherently unstable. And we don't think that's a good place to build a dam. And he said, well, we'll be able to engineer our way out of it by throwing enough concrete and rebar to make sure that it withholds. About 6 months after they filled up the dam, it started to leak. The news was going out, and the next morning it completely broke asunder and sent a wall of water down the Ventura River. You guys know where Six Flags is, near Valencia, California? Everybody who lived in that part was completely drowned. Basically, it's coming out of the mountains, rolled over Six Flags, and then quite a few people up and down the Ventura River were also flooded and killed. It was fascinating to go there, and I made a little movie along the way. It's a very hard site to find. It's not marked. Nobody really wants you to know about it. You can actually drive by it and not even see it. But because we were looking for it, we finally realized we had driven past it, went back, and got out on the ground. And it's fascinating to see this huge hole in a concrete abutment and imagine what happened. Let me now turn my attention to the section of the state down along the Mexican border. One of my readings that I found absolutely fascinating was the story about how the Salton Sea was flooded around the turn of the last century. And very briefly, the story goes, George Chafee, the water engineer, was hired by the California Development Company to come down, investigate the delta area of the Colorado, at which point he realized old channels that flowed to the north to the Salton Sea could be enlarged to bring water to the Imperial Valley. The plan was hatched to divert the water into Mexico and bring it into a corporation and then sell it back to settlers in the Imperial Valley. And it worked pretty well for a couple of years, and then the channel started to silt up. At that point, they had Chafee go back and look, and he said, well, if we enlarge it a little bit more, we make it a little bit deeper, we can continue to deliver water to the Imperial Valley. At that point, right around the turn of the last century, a series of El Nino years created epic floods on the Colorado. And the enlarged opening completely blew open and flooded the Salton Sea. The entire Colorado River went up to the Salton Sea. It took 6 years to put out the flood. The consortium was unable to stop it. They sold shares to Harriman of the railroad in the Bay Area. And he said, well, we'll help you out if I get some of your shares, you know. And he built a rail line down here to deliver rock and gravel and spent a couple of years, lost his shirt. They still couldn't stop it. And in 1906, the earthquake ruined San Francisco and took out his entire empire. And he said, we're cutting you guys off. I got to cut my losses. At that point, the federal government said, all right, you guys, we will stop the flood. We're going to take the rail lines that Mr. Harriman had already built and just keep sending gravel and rock until it finally stops. And at that point, we're putting you guys out of business, and no longer will we allow citizens to take a public resource and sell it back to the public. That's when they built the all-American canal, and it runs to this day. Why did that happen? The river's flowing, the only time rivers flow away from each other is at the bottom of the river on a delta. It's everywhere else, they're always converging. It's just the way rivers are. It shows us that this was a delta, and what's happened is the San Andreas Fault has cut across the delta. The river, the Colorado I'm speaking, used to flow straight to the coast, and that's what I'm showing here, across more or less where Los Angeles is today. All of that's gone. It's all been covered through geologic processes. But when I found that out, I thought, God, that's just fascinating. The river changed course. That caused the creation of the Grand Canyon. When the river shortened, I actually took a geology class at Stanford, and we studied the Grand Canyon. And I don't remember anything about this, so that would have been in the 70s. Since then, geologists have figured this story out, that the reason it got cut, and you can see the oxbows, I mean, that would have been a slow-moving river to get that kind of curve, and then it would have risen slowly because the river was shortened. If you shorten a river, the gradient increases. It's just the physics of water. There was no map. I basically just pulled it out of my head and my knowledge of the area, and I could paint it very, very loosely. We're near the end of the series. What I do is I get momentum, and this really is some serious momentum. Before I got the sabbatical, I did a retrospective at Soka University in Aliso Viejo, Orange County, and I was working very hard to get that. I showed some older works, I showed some newer works. That was 2 or 3 years of continuous painting. Then on top of that, another 2 years. So after about 5 years of painting, I can almost paint this in my sleep. Same thing happened to me when I was in New York. I could paint the entire boroughs of New York City just from memory, having done it multiple times. This is a 2 big panel piece. This is actually all drawing. It probably took me 2 or 3 days just to draw the ocean. This is a pretty good size painting, almost as big as what you see there. This is what I use to make the biggest paintings. As you get bigger, detail, it gets in the way. I found a map that all it had was the watersheds, the rivers and the lakes. And everything else I filled in from my own knowledge and using other maps. So this is the exact map that was projected for the one we just saw, and the next one, which is the last painting from the Sabbatical. This is my largest work. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doors. I've used this offset for years. This refers to satellite imagery, and if you have a satellite and it scans the Earth and the Earth is moving, it creates a parallelogram. This is my play on the parallelograms of space, more than all of Southern California. This brings you current. I just went to Death Valley. I hadn't been to Death Valley for years. The geology is so inspirational. I'm teaching painting again, having not taught painting for 10 years. And one of the things I do in painting is go over supports. I think I mentioned I've been painting on these panels for years. I brought canvas stretcher bars from New York that I had not used for 15 years. I finally said, it's time to stretch that. I can do demos for my class, and now I'm looking at 4 or 5 large canvases. This is inspiration from Artist's Palette and the amazing geology that you find in Death Valley. So these are all done from the last couple of weeks. Again, going back to a geologic map of Death Valley. They're almost the opposite of my Sabbatical works, which were a very low key color, mostly white. These are full of bright, intense impasto colors. And as I usually do, I start small. Now this is a fairly good sized canvas, expanding the scene. It will dry, and I will sand it, and I will patina it, and I will bring up, there's a river here that I'm interested in, the Amargosa River, and it's not showing very well at the moment. I'll redraw that when the painting's done to make sure that that can be seen. This is a 2-panel piece. What you can see here is when I have a panel, I can draw a little bit harder and scratch into the surface more. All this is drawing into wet paint. And this is the last slide that I have for you. These are 2 50-inch square canvases of Death Valley. This is the valley itself. Again, I would channel my Dante's view coming up in here and knowing where the sand dunes are and playing off my experience and using the map. That is the on-demand presentation. We're not quite done. I hope I have a little time. I need to play a couple of these other short ditties for you. Before moving on to the last part of this presentation, which is a self-narrated expose of my backstory, I would like to state for the record how I know I have directly impacted student success here at Copper Mountain College. There are clearly many benefits to having been granted a 2-semester sabbatical, and although many are intangible, I strongly believe I can point out 3 tangible and material benefits to my students and my school. The first student success benefit I would like to cite is my renewed passion for the art of oil painting and the momentum I have built from all my recent studio practice. A momentum I bring back to the classroom as I have just returned to teaching fine art painting at the college level. After I completed my sabbatical, I reevaluated my CMC painting course and decided to completely revamp and rewrite my course syllabus. I am seeing this semester the results of improving the syllabus. It is very refreshing to return to this visual art form that I have been perfecting my whole life and see the current interest young artists have in the skills of painting. Many new students are seeing the value of learning traditional painting mediums. Much of the renewed interest is coming from the ever-increasing importance of animation, gaming, and both virtual and mixed realities that employ digital technologies, but nonetheless favor those who have traditional skill sets as well. The fact that I chose old-school analog painting as the focus of my sabbatical project was because I felt it would benefit our art department the most, as I knew I was going back to teaching the subject after a 10-year hiatus. The second direct benefit my students and my college are receiving is exposure to my now considerably deep knowledge about the very particular history of our great state of California. As it is on a regular basis, I teach a lot of history in all my art classes, and certainly history of photography, currently my most popular class. Not a week goes by where I do not reference the research and travels I was able to undertake by having a full year out of the classroom. This presentation demonstrates just a fraction of the new knowledge and insight I have gained as to what makes California such a special place and culture. The third benefit to student success is as direct as it comes, namely engaging 16 students, most drawn from my very active CMC Multimedia Club, for which I am faculty advisor, in hands-on documentary video production. Over the course of 2 months during fall semester 2015, no less than 12 CMC students were involved with crewing the pre-production and production of my 24-minute documentary made as part of my sabbatical contract. See the credits of this production for details of how to find this rather creative piece of filmmaking on YouTube. This 6-camera live mix production was shot in my state-of-the-art studio, surrounded by the 50-plus paintings I had just completed for this project, A History of Southern California Landscape. In addition, 4 CMC students were engaged in making the show you are currently watching. Since I strongly believe direct hands-on learning is the most effective way to teach students multimedia skills, I go way beyond my job description to make sure my students get real-world training in camera operation, sound engineering, lighting work, and set management. All crucial elements for professional video production in this vital and expanding worldwide industry. I will conclude this section by stressing that this is one of my strongest contributions I make to the success of my students, my college, and my community. So this is my story that explains why I paint from maps and why I paint from satellite images. It's well known that everybody's a product of their generation. What you're going to see here is my early story. I ended up writing a 17-page outline only on why I paint from maps. We're going to see my time in Pasadena until I was 10 years old, and when I moved to Arizona. and was involved in the Rocket Club. What you're going to find is I grew up in an age where these images were coming back to the planet for the very first time. The space race was underway. And to me, that was one of the most fascinating things I was seeing, this view of the world from above, whether it was a satellite, an aerial photograph, whether it was mapped. So we're going to go out with this on the backstory here.
When I reflect on my earliest memories, I return mentally to my childhood home in Pasadena. I'm talking about the years 1954, when I was born above the Arroyo Seco in the Huntington Hospital, to 1964, when I moved to Arizona. I was being raised in a house full of women. My mother, Agnes, my two older sisters, Jane and Ann, and Maria, a Mexican nanny who called me Pancho. My mom was wise and realized she should send me to a day camp so I could experience outdoor activities. I didn't have brothers, so it made sense to send me out and about. So off I went to Tom Sawyer's Boys Camp. More accurately, I would describe the camp as an experiment in roughing up young boys on purpose. We day campers were the guinea pigs for the crazed surfer dude counselors who were hell-bent on taking us to slippery, dangerous waterfalls in the mountains and running around the steep, rocky, dusty fire breaks to see how scuffed up we could get while keeping injuries to a minimum. No worries about complaining parents. Then there was the digging tunnels into the sandy ground, and even shoring up the hand-dug tunnels with wooden framing, all taking place in front of the camp at the base of the Devil's Gate Dam. All of this was in the shadow of JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was connected to Caltech. Of course, JPL was a big player in the national arena as part of the space race. There, right behind the Devil's Gate, was the complex for developing rocket science and sending probes out into the solar system, the probes and the capsules that would capture images of Earth. It was these amazingly intricate images of space. Even at this early age, I was captivated by the satellite imagery that was coming into the culture. As a youngster, I found it unforgettable and inspiring to see the Earth in this new way and in such detail. In 1964, my mother remarried, and I moved at age 10 to the Sonoran Desert, to a town 54 miles northwest of Phoenix, the Dude Ranch capital of the world, Wickenburg, Arizona. So here I am, all of a sudden in a desert, and it was time to immediately switch up my model making. Oh, I hadn't yet mentioned that boys like me growing up in that 50s do-it-by-making-it ethos were encouraged, even expected to make things. We made models. For me, first it was models of monsters. Godzilla, the Mummy, Wolfman. In Arizona, it became rockets, real flying, even explosive rockets. The feeling was that as youngsters, we could involve ourselves directly, or perhaps more indirectly, in the space race. We could actually set up launch pads and recovery zones and a safe zone for escaping rocket engines. Of course, we set off dry-powdered and explosive engines unattached to a rocket body, knowing full well they would zigzag and fly uncontrollably around the launch pad. Really death-defying to 11 and 12-year-olds. Gladly, no one was hit or hurt, or at least not badly, as I recall. Anyway, I was already feeling the vision and wanted to see what the rockets could see when they shot 1,000 feet above a rugged Sonoran desert terrain. I could kind of imagine the view, but when the first CamRock, a rocket with a camera, was released by the Centauri Corporation, I was eager to get one, or as it turned out, wait until a friend ponied up and ruined his, which is what happened. The camera was a one-shot device, timed to trip the shutter when the camera was just starting to dive back to Earth. So it was presumably looking straight down to take a picture and snapping the one pic just before another charge would blow off the top of the capsule and release the parachute. Something went wrong that maiden flight, and the whole kit and caboodle just kept accelerating in a deadly free fall, camera head first, straight back to a rocky ledge just off the edge of a cliff face north of our launch location. We heard, but did not see, the final impact.